April 18th, 1941. The sky above Augsburg thundered with the pulse of piston engines. The rhythmic growl of the Messerschmitt Bf 109s echoed across the airfield, a sound that had come to symbolize German dominance in the skies. But behind a set of sealed hangar doors, away from the proud noise of the Luftwaffe, another sound was being born. In a dim workshop, filled with the sharp scent of oil and ozone, Dr. Hans Joachim Pabst von Ohain stood over a machine that most believed was madness. It wasn't driven by pistons or propellers. It had no spinning blades to cut through the air. It breathed fire. 2 experimental jet turbines rested on their mounts, gleaming faintly under the work lamps. Wires, gauges, and fuel lines snaked across the floor. A small group of engineers stood nearby, uncertain whether they were about to witness a breakthrough or another explosion. The whine began low, a distant metallic hum that grew with frightening speed. The pitch rose higher, sharper, until it became a scream. Metal quivered. The floor vibrated. Someone shouted that the temperature was climbing too fast, that the bearings were melting. Von Ohain didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the spinning core of the machine, mesmerized by the light of the flame inside. A moment later, the turbine tore itself apart. A flash, a deafening bang, and a wave of heat filled the room. Shards of steel clattered across the walls. When the smoke cleared, the machine was destroyed. Failure again. Fritz Wendel, Messerschmitt's chief test pilot, pulled off his goggles and spat on the floor. "These engines will kill us before they ever fly," he muttered. Von Ohain said nothing. He simply stared at the blackened wreck, breathing slowly, his mind already dissecting what had gone wrong. The others saw only smoke and waste. He saw data, patterns, lessons hidden in the ruins. Every failed test was a step closer to success. For years, the Luftwaffe had mocked the jet concept. It was too complex, too fragile, too wasteful. Germany needed fighters now, not fantasies that consumed rare metals and fuel the war could not spare. But von Ohain refused to surrender to practicality. He believed the age of the propeller was ending, and the age of the jet was waiting. If only someone dared to bring it to life. Elsewhere in the factory, Willy Messerschmitt was fighting his own battle. Brilliant, arrogant, and relentless, he had built his empire on speed and efficiency. His Bf 109 had carried the Luftwaffe to its early victories, but he knew its limits. Each new Allied design was faster, tougher, more advanced. The future belonged to whoever could break free of the propeller. He saw in von Ohain's engines not a curiosity, but a revolution. Against orders from the Air Ministry, he authorized secret work on the Project 1065, the jet fighter that would one day become the Me 262. Official reports disguised the project as experimental aerodynamics research. Only a handful of trusted engineers knew what they were truly building. They worked at night, after regular shifts ended, cutting turbine blades by hand under the glow of desk lamps. When parts failed, they scavenged scrap from other departments. When fuel was scarce, they siphoned it from training aircraft. Each explosion, each mechanical collapse, only hardened their resolve. Outside, the war was accelerating. France had fallen. Britain stood defiant. In Berlin, the Reich's leaders demanded new bombers, new tanks, new victories. But in Augsburg, a different kind of weapon was taking shape, one not yet ready for war, but already defying it. Von Ohain often worked until dawn. Sometimes he would stand at the far end of the hangar, watching the test flame burn inside the engine, a living streak of blue light dancing in the dark. The sound it made was unlike anything else in the world, smooth, continuous, unbroken. Not the rhythmic thump of pistons, but a steady, unstoppable roar. One evening, Messerschmitt appeared beside him. "Still chasing the impossible?" he asked. Von Ohain smiled faintly. "The impossible just takes longer." Messerschmitt's reply was quiet but certain. "Then make it happen faster." Outside, the night was filled with the rumble of propeller-driven fighters taking off for routine drills. Inside, another sound was being born, a sound the world did not yet understand. It was the first whisper of an age that would change flight forever. On that day in April 1941, amid the smoke and failure of one forgotten experiment, the future of aviation took its first breath. What began as a crazy idea in a hidden workshop would soon become the most feared aircraft in the world. The story of the Me-262 did not begin in war, but in curiosity. Years before the first German jet took shape, Hans von Ohain was a quiet university student in Göttingen, a mind consumed by the mystery of speed. While his peers were studying the lift of wings and the drag of propellers, he was sketching engines with no blades at all, cylinders that would inhale air, ignite it, and create pure thrust. In 1933, while Germany was rebuilding from defeat and rearming in secret, von Ohain submitted his doctoral thesis on a revolutionary concept, a self-contained turbine engine that could sustain continuous combustion. The physics was sound, but the technology did not yet exist to build it. Every professor who reviewed the work admired its elegance and dismissed it as unworkable. Ingenious, one examiner wrote, but physically impossible to realize. Von Ohain didn't care. In the evenings, he built crude models from scrap metal in a garage behind his landlady's house. The first engine melted within minutes. The second never ignited. The third produced a faint, steady thrust before shaking itself apart. The failures only deepened his conviction that the idea could be made real. By chance, his experiments caught the attention of Ernst Heinkel, one of Germany's most daring aircraft designers. Heinkel was obsessed with speed, not for war, but for the thrill of breaking limits. When von Ohain presented his turbine concept, Heinkel saw what no one else did, the end of propellers. In 1937, at Heinkel's private airfield in Rostock, the first Her-178 jet aircraft rose from the runway, a small, stubby-winged plane that made history in silence. It stayed airborne for barely 6 minutes, but it worked. It proved that jet propulsion was possible. The Luftwaffe showed little interest. Jet technology was expensive, fragile, and untested in combat. Interesting, they said, but impractical. Heinkel protested. He was ignored. The He-178 was pushed into storage, and von Ohain's work was sidelined. Then came Willy Messerschmitt. Messerschmitt was everything von Ohain was not: brash, political, relentless. He was a businessman wrapped in the skin of an engineer, a man who built machines as extensions of his will. His Bf-109 had already made him indispensable to the Reich's war effort. But he hungered for more than success. He wanted to redefine flight itself. When he learned of Heinkel's discarded jet experiments, he summoned von Ohain to Augsburg. Their first meeting was brief, tense, electric. Messerschmitt demanded to know how fast a jet could go. Von Ohain answered without hesitation: "Faster than sound can catch it." From that moment, the alliance was sealed. The physicist with the dream met the industrialist with the means. Messerschmitt offered what Heinkel could not: the vast resources of the Reich's most powerful aircraft company. But he also imposed one condition: secrecy. The project would be hidden from the Luftwaffe's bureaucracy, shielded from politics and oversight. It would operate under a false name, Project 1065, a string of numbers that meant nothing to anyone outside the company. Work began in 1939. The first designs were nothing more than outlines: 2 underwing engines, swept fuselage, tricycle landing gear, radical choices for the time. Most of the engineers assigned to the project were skeptical. They whispered that their leader had gone mad, that he was wasting manpower on a fantasy. Von Ohain ignored them. He had waited years for this chance. He lived for the quiet hours after midnight when the factory floor emptied, and the only sounds were the scratch of pencils on drafting paper and the faint hum of experimental turbines spinning in test rigs. The early engines were crude, compressors that seized after minutes, turbines that cracked under heat. Yet progress was undeniable. The team began producing small bursts of sustained thrust, then longer, smoother runs. Each success, however small, carried a sense of awe. One evening, after a particularly promising test, Messerschmitt stood beside von Ohain, watching the glowing exhaust fade into darkness. "You've built something no one else in the world has," he said. "If we can make it fly, we can change the war." Von Ohain's answer was quiet, almost reverent. "I didn't build it to change war. I built it to change flight." The distinction mattered little to Messerschmitt. To him, innovation and power were inseparable. And in the coming years, as Europe descended deeper into conflict, that fragile partnership, one man driven by science, the other by ambition, would give birth to a machine that blurred the line between the possible and the unthinkable. By 1940, Project 1065 had moved from sketches to metal. A prototype fuselage lay on the assembly floor, its curves sleek and alien. The wings were fitted for 2 jet engines still under development by BMW. Engineers worked with quiet intensity, aware that they were constructing something no human being had ever flown. Outside, the war was changing shape. The Battle of Britain had proven that air superiority would decide the future. Germany needed faster aircraft, desperately. But inside Messerschmitt's sealed hangars, the answer was already taking form, hidden beneath tarps and coded reports. The piston engine still ruled the skies. But in Augsburg, 2 men were preparing to dethrone it. By the beginning of 1942, the war had swallowed everything: time, steel, fuel, men. Factories that once dreamed of the future now labored for survival. Every machine was built to fight, every engineer measured by how quickly he could deliver. Amid this storm, the small jet team at Messerschmitt pressed on, working in defiance of war's impatience. The first prototype of the new aircraft, Me 262 V1, stood ready. It was unlike anything that had ever rolled out of a hangar before. Narrow fuselage, thin swept wings, landing gear tucked beneath it like a bird poised to strike. Beneath each wing hung a newly designed BMW 003 jet engine, still unproven, still fragile, still more theory than machine. On a grey morning in early 1942, Fritz Wendel climbed into the cockpit for its first attempt at flight. He was the most daring pilot Messerschmitt had, a man with nerves of steel and a mechanic's instinct for survival. Mechanics swarmed around the jet, tightening bolts, checking fuel lines, praying under their breath. The engines coughed, whined, and finally screamed to life. The pitch rose until the air itself seemed to vibrate. For a moment, it felt as though the world had stopped to listen. Then, with a violent sputter, the sound died. The turbines seized. Both engines failed before takeoff. Smoke poured from the nacelles. The test was over before it began. The Me 262 rolled to a halt in silence, its revolutionary promise reduced to a lifeless shell. Word of the failure spread quickly. The Luftwaffe inspectors arrived days later, their faces heavy with disapproval. They questioned every detail: the wasted materials, the unreliable engines, the reckless secrecy. "This project is a luxury," one officer declared. "We are fighting a war, not chasing fantasies." For Messerschmitt, it was a humiliation. For von Ohain, it was another lesson. The problem wasn't the aircraft. It was the heart that powered it. The BMW 003 was simply not ready. The Luftwaffe ordered production halted, but Messerschmitt refused to surrender. He could not bear to see years of work buried under bureaucracy. In a decision both desperate and brilliant, he ordered a temporary fix: install a Jumo 210 piston engine in the nose, a jet with a propeller, an insult to its own design, yet a lifeline to keep it alive. The hybrid Me 262 flew that spring, slow and awkward, its elegant form mocked by the spinning blade on its nose. But it flew, and every second in the air gave the engineers something precious. Data, aerodynamic readings, control responses, stress analysis. They learned how the wings handled speed, how the tail surfaces bent under pressure, how the fuselage sliced through the air. What had begun as a compromise became a breakthrough. The airframe worked. It was sound, stable, and deadly fast, even with the wrong engine. In secret, the team pushed on with the next stage. BMW was out. Junkers stepped in with a new design. The Jumo 04, developed under Anselm Franz. The 004 was heavier and less elegant than von Ohain's early turbines, but it promised reliability, a word that had become sacred. Throughout 1942, prototypes of the new engines arrived from the Junkers plant at Dessau. They failed constantly. Bearings burned, blades warped. The engines lasted mere hours before falling apart. Yet each failure moved the team closer to success. Von Ohain and Franz corresponded obsessively, trading sketches and notes through coded memos, revising tolerances by fractions of millimeters. As winter settled over Germany, the Me 262 stood again on the runway, now fitted with the new engines. The day before the test, Wendell walked the length of the aircraft, running his gloved hand along its smooth metal skin. "She looks alive," he said quietly. The next morning, he took off. The roar that followed was like nothing the engineers had ever heard. Not the rhythmic beat of pistons, but a steady, rising scream, pure thrust, unbroken and unrestrained. The Me 262 lifted from the ground, smooth and sure, climbing faster than any aircraft in history. For a few brief minutes, the dream became real. The world's first true jet fighter had flown. When Wendell landed, the airfield erupted in applause. Mechanics cheered, engineers wept. For a single moment, they believed they had changed the future. But even as the celebrations echoed across the hangar, a shadow loomed. Word of the flight reached Berlin, and with it, the attention of Adolf Hitler. The jet's fate would soon leave the hands of the men who had built it. In 1942, the Me 262 had proven that the age of the jet had begun, yet the war it was built for would nearly destroy it before it could rise again. By 1943, the world had entered its darkest hour. Allied bombers filled the skies over Germany, raining destruction on cities, factories, and rail lines. The Luftwaffe, once invincible, was being torn apart. Its aces were dying faster than they could be replaced. Its aircraft, the pride of the Reich, were now slower, weaker, outnumbered. In the midst of that chaos, one machine still whispered of salvation, the Messerschmitt Me 262. But the whisper had to become a roar. The new Jumo 004 engines from Junkers were finally ready for testing. They were heavier, hotter, and hungrier than anything built before. Each produced 800 kilograms of thrust, a force that, when doubled, promised to propel an aircraft faster than any human had ever flown. Yet they were fragile, their turbine blades burning out after mere hours of operation. For weeks, engineers worked day and night at Augsburg, testing and retesting every bolt, every weld, every line of fuel. Mechanics packed the hangar floors, their hands black with oil and sweat. Failure had become a familiar companion, but now the air carried something else: anticipation. On July 18, 1942, after months of waiting, Fritz Wendell prepared to take off once more, this time with two Jumo 004s under his wings. The test field fell silent. The turbines began to spin, slow at first, then rising into a piercing shriek that rolled across the valley. The earth itself seemed to hum. The Me 262 began to move. Its acceleration was effortless, smooth, unnatural. The wheels left the ground. In an instant, it was airborne. The engineers watched as the silver shape climbed higher and higher, cutting through the clouds with a sound that no one had ever heard before, not the choppy thrum of pistons, but the continuous howl of a storm. Wendell pushed the throttles forward. The airframe shuddered, then steadied. The altimeter climbed faster than any had before. Moments later, the Me-262 streaked past the airfield at 540 miles per hour, leaving behind only the faint scream of its engines and a trail of disbelief. The impossible had become real. For the men on the ground, it was a moment that defied imagination. They had just watched the future of flight break the sound of war. Engineers stood frozen in silence. Others cheered. One mechanic dropped to his knees and laughed through tears. Word of the flight reached Berlin within hours. At first, the news was met with confusion, then awe. Reports described a fighter that could outrun every Allied plane, climb faster than any interceptor, and carry enough firepower to shatter bomber formations in seconds. But when the message reached Adolf Hitler, it was misinterpreted. He saw in this new machine not an air superiority weapon, but a fast bomber, a tool for attack, not defense. In his mind, the Me-262's speed made it perfect for striking Allied ships and cities before they could react. It must carry bombs, he insisted. It will be my Blitz bomber. Messerschmitt tried to argue. The design was built for agility, not payload. Its thin wings were meant for speed, not weight. Adding bombs would slow it down and ruin its balance. He pleaded for the jet to remain a fighter, Germany's only hope to defend its skies. Hitler would not listen. The order was given. The Me-262 would be converted into a bomber. That decision nearly destroyed the project. Designers scrambled to add bomb racks and targeting equipment. The changes threw off the aircraft's center of gravity. Test flights became dangerous again. Engines overheated. A string of crashes followed. Progress halted. Von Ohain and his team could only watch as their dream was reshaped into something grotesque. A jet built for speed forced to crawl under the weight of bombs. For months, the program teetered on the edge of collapse. And yet, despite the interference, despite the endless setbacks, the Me-262 refused to die. The engineers continued refining it in secret, removing unnecessary modifications whenever they could, returning it slowly to its true form. By the end of 1943, they had perfected the engines, strengthened the wings, and smoothed the fuselage. The aircraft was no longer an experiment. It was a weapon. Pilots who tested it spoke with awe. The thrust pinned them to their seats. The climb rate was dizzying. The sensation of power was absolute. When the throttle opened, there was no vibration, no hesitation, only the endless surge of acceleration, as if the air itself had surrendered. The engineers called it the Schwalbe, the swallow, graceful, deadly, and untouchable. The Me-262 had finally come alive. It was ready to fly, to fight, to terrify the skies. But it had been born into a world already crumbling. The war it was meant to win was slipping away. And though its wings were ready, the men who controlled its destiny were not. The jet age had arrived, but it would enter the world not in triumph, but in tragedy. By 1944, the Reich was burning. The Allied air forces now ruled the skies. Day after day, endless waves of American B-17s and British Lancasters darkened the horizon, leaving trails of smoke over the shattered remains of German cities. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Europe, was exhausted, its squadrons broken, its pilots lost. Yet in the factories at Augsburg and Regensburg, men still worked through the nights, assembling a machine that seemed more myth than weapon. The Messerschmitt Me 262, sleek and silver, waited like a predator caged by its own creation. It was the fastest aircraft ever built, capable of speeds the Allies could not yet comprehend. It was ready, but the war it was born for was already being lost. When the first operational jets were delivered in mid-1944, they were assigned to an experimental unit, Erprobungskommando 262. The pilots chosen were veterans, men who had survived since the early days of Poland and France. They were skeptical. Many believed the jet too dangerous to fly, too fragile to trust. Their fears were not unfounded. The Jumo 004 engines were powerful but treacherous. At low speed, they flamed out. At high power, they overheated. If throttled too quickly, they exploded. Each flight was a dance between power and destruction. The first missions were cautious. Takeoffs required long runways and perfect timing. Landings demanded a surgeon's touch. One mistake, and the jet would stall and crash before it ever reached the ground. Yet those who mastered it discovered something extraordinary. The Me 262 didn't fly like any other aircraft. It didn't climb, it surged. It didn't turn, it cut through the air. Its acceleration was instant, its motion eerily smooth, as if gravity itself had loosened its grip. Pilots who survived their first sorties spoke with reverence. One said, "You don't fly it, you unleash it." Then, on July 26, 1944, the jet drew first blood. Lieutenant Alfred Schreiber, flying an Me 262 over Munich, intercepted a British Mosquito reconnaissance plane. The Mosquito was among the fastest Allied aircraft in service, nearly untouchable to piston-driven fighters. But the Me 262 closed in effortlessly. In a matter of seconds, Schreiber fired his 4 30mm cannons. The Mosquito disintegrated in mid-air. It was the first jet kill in history. Word spread like wildfire. Allied air crews began reporting silver arrows streaking through bomber formations, impossible to catch or evade. Some dismissed them as hallucinations until they saw the wreckage. The jet was no rumor now. It was real, and it was lethal. The Luftwaffe formed its first jet wing soon after, Jagdgeschwader 7, under Major Walter Nowotny, one of Germany's top aces. They called themselves the Stormbirds. The Allies called them something else. Whistling Death. By late 1944, the Me 262 was tearing through bomber formations with terrifying ease. A single burst from its cannons could shatter a flying fortress. At full speed, it could climb out of range before the bomber's gunners could even react. When Allied fighters tried to intercept, they found themselves chasing ghosts. But the jet had one fatal weakness: its vulnerability during takeoff and landing. The engines needed long runways and gradual acceleration. Allied intelligence soon discovered this flaw and ordered fighter patrols near known airfields. Many Me 262s were destroyed before they ever left the ground. For the pilots who survived, flying the jet was both ecstasy and torment. They described the sensation of raw, uncontrollable power, the feeling that the world bent around them when the engines screamed to full thrust. Yet each sortie carried the same knowledge. One mistake, one misfire, and the aircraft would turn from angel to coffin. The Me 262's speed was unmatched, but it arrived too late and in too few numbers. Germany's industry was collapsing under the weight of Allied bombing. Fuel was scarce. Spare parts were rarer still. Each engine lasted barely 25 hours. Each flight risked another irreplaceable machine. And still, they fought. In the final months of the war, Me 262 squadrons rose from crumbling airfields to face thousands of Allied bombers alone. Against impossible odds, they struck fear into the hearts of enemy crews. One bomber pilot later said, "It was like being attacked by a weapon from another world." For the men who built it, the jet was vindication. For the men who flew it, it was both miracle and curse. The Me 262 had proven itself beyond question. It was faster than any pursuit aircraft on Earth. But its brilliance had come too late to change the course of history. Even as its pilots mastered the art of jet combat, the war around them was collapsing. Germany's cities burned, its armies retreated, its skies, once the domain of the eagle, were closing in. The Swallow had learned to fly, but the storm that birthed it was already ending. By the dawn of 1945, the Messerschmitt Me 262 had become both a marvel and a monument to lost time. It was the most advanced aircraft the world had ever seen, a jet that could slice through bomber formations like lightning through cloud. But the empire it served was already dying. Factories lay in ruins. The supply chains that once fed Germany's war machine were broken. Allied bombing raids had crippled the industrial heart of the Reich. Entire production lines vanished overnight under the rain of fire. Even the jet's own creators worked in fear. Augsburg, once alive with the sound of hammers and engines, now echoed with air raid sirens and explosions. The engineers who had built the impossible were now building it in darkness, repairing machines by candlelight, hiding blueprints from the bombs that fell above them. The Jumo 004 engines were the Me 262's greatest strength and its greatest flaw. Each was a masterpiece of engineering, yet each was doomed to fail. Lacking the rare, heat-resistant metals that only peacetime could supply, the turbines burned out after a few dozen hours of flight. Mechanics learned to listen for the subtle change in pitch that meant a blade was about to fail, the sound that separated a safe landing from a fatal fall. Fuel was even scarcer than engines. Pilots sometimes received only enough for a single combat sortie, and often less. Planes were rolled out for missions they could barely complete, flown on fumes, gliding home to land on empty tanks. Many never returned at all. By then, the Luftwaffe had collapsed into chaos. Experienced aces were dead or missing. The new pilots assigned to the Me 262 were young, barely trained, terrified, and given only a handful of hours to learn how to control the world's most dangerous aircraft. Where once men like Nowotny had ruled the air, now desperate boys were sent into combat, their instructors killed before their lessons could end. The results were predictable and tragic. Jets crashed on takeoff, on landing, during basic maneuvers. The few that made it into battle faced overwhelming odds, a sky filled with hundreds of Allied fighters and bombers. Even so, the Me 262 earned its legend. In brief, violent flashes of brilliance, it turned the tide of battle, if only for moments. Pilots who mastered it could climb beyond reach, dive at impossible speed, and strike with the fury of a storm. The plane was nearly untouchable once airborne. But the airfields were death traps. Allied command quickly learned to exploit this weakness. Squadrons of P-51 Mustangs began circling near Me 262 bases, waiting for the jets to slow for landing. Dozens were shot down before they could even retract their landing gear. The future of aviation was being slaughtered in its cradle. Still, the legend grew. One American bomber crew recorded seeing a silver arrow rip through their formation at twice the speed of any known fighter. Another report described a ghost, visible for only a heartbeat, then gone. But for every Allied story of terror, there was a German story of loss. Planes that could have changed the war sat in hangars with no engines, no fuel, no pilots. The factories that built them were smoking ruins. The war had consumed its own miracle. Hans von Ohain watched from afar as his creation entered combat. He had given Germany and the world the gift of jet propulsion. Yet what he saw in those final months was not triumph, but tragedy. The Me 262 had proven that his dream was possible, but it had arrived in the wrong time and in the wrong hands. Willy Messerschmitt fought until the end to keep production alive, but even he knew the truth. The machine he had built to secure victory had become an artifact of defeat, a weapon too advanced for its own era. By April 1945, as Allied forces closed in from all directions, the remaining Me 262s were scattered across makeshift airfields, hidden beneath trees, guarded by pilots who knew their cause was lost. When the order finally came to destroy what remained, some refused. They couldn't bear to burn what they had built. The last missions of the Me 262 were desperate, symbolic gestures. Small groups of jets rose from broken runways to face entire squadrons of enemy aircraft. They fought, they killed, and they died. Not for victory, but for history. In the end, fewer than 1/400 Me 262s were ever built. Barely 300 saw combat. Yet in those brief months, they changed everything. The Swallow had proven that man could fly beyond the limits of propeller and piston. It had shown the world a glimpse of the future. Fast, sleek, merciless. But the future had come too late. Germany lay in ruins. Its dream of dominance had turned to ash. And amid the wreckage of its ambitions, the jet that might have saved it lay scattered in pieces, a miracle consumed by the very war that demanded it. May 1945. The guns fell silent. The skies over Europe, once filled with flame and thunder, were empty at last. The war that had consumed the world was over. The Reich had fallen. Its cities were shattered ruins, its armies broken, its leaders gone. In the smouldering remains of airfields across Germany, Allied soldiers discovered something extraordinary. Hidden beneath tarps, buried in hangars, and scattered among craters, lay dozens of sleek silver aircraft, unlike anything they had ever seen. They were the remnants of the Messerschmitt Me 262 program. Engineers from Britain, America, and the Soviet Union crowded around the captured jets in awe. Some of the aircraft were intact, others torn open by explosions or abandoned mid-assembly. Their engines were unlike anything the Allies possessed. Every rivet, every weld, every curve told a story of a technology decades ahead of its time. Teams were dispatched immediately to recover and transport the machines. In England, scientists at Farnborough studied the jet's engines with disbelief. The Americans shipped several to Wright Field, Ohio, where test pilots were ordered to fly them. The Soviets loaded others onto rail cars and sent them east for analysis. The verdict was unanimous. This was the future. The Me 262 had proven that jet propulsion was not only possible, it was inevitable. Within months, research programs across the victorious nations exploded into action. Britain accelerated its work on the Gloucester Meteor. America pushed forward with prototypes that would become the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, and the Soviet Union began experiments that would lead to the MiG-9 and eventually the MiG-15. Each bore traces of the Me 262's design, its swept wings, its underwing engines, its tricycle landing gear. The lessons learned from the wreckage of the Swallow would shape every jet fighter for decades to come. For the men who had built it, the end of the war brought an uncertain peace. Willy Messerschmitt was arrested and briefly imprisoned for his role in producing aircraft for the Nazi regime. He emerged from captivity, bitter but unbroken, eventually returning to aviation to design civil aircraft and gliders in the post-war years. Hans von Ohain, the dreamer whose vision had started it all, found a very different fate. Like many German scientists and engineers, he was recruited by the Americans through Operation Paperclip. He emigrated to the United States and began a new chapter of his life at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where his work on jet propulsion continued, this time for peace, not for war. In America, von Ohain was finally recognized for what he truly was, a pioneer, not of destruction, but of innovation. He collaborated with American engineers, refined turbine efficiency, and helped lay the foundation for the next generation of jet engines, the ones that would carry not bombs, but passengers. The world entered the jet age almost overnight. The sound that once terrified bomber crews now became the anthem of a new era, one of speed, progress, and connection. By the 1950s, jetliners like the de Havilland Comet and Boeing 707 were crossing oceans in hours. Fighters broke the sound barrier, then reached twice its speed. And in every roar of every engine, a trace of the Me 262 still lived, the echo of that first impossible dream, born in a smoke-filled hangar at Augsburg. Historians would later debate what might have happened if the jet had come sooner, if the Me 262 had flown in numbers large enough to challenge the Allies before their dominance was absolute. Some claimed it could have delayed defeat. Others believed it might have changed little, but all agreed on one thing: it changed the future. In the ruins of war, the jet emerged not as a symbol of Germany's power, but of humanity's relentless drive to go faster, higher, and further. Hans von Ohain never forgot the moment his first turbine roared to life. Decades later, when asked what he had felt that day, he answered simply, "It was the sound of freedom, even if we didn't yet understand it." From that freedom came the machines that would carry astronauts to space, travelers across continents, and humanity beyond the limits of Earth itself. The Me 262 had been born as a weapon of desperation. It died as a marvel of engineering. But its spirit, that hunger to transcend, became the foundation of modern flight. The swallow never truly vanished. It became the wind beneath every jet that followed. The story of the Me 262 ends where it began, in silence. Not the silence of failure this time, but of awe. When the last of the swallows were captured, when their engines cooled and their pilots were taken away, the roar that had once torn the sky was gone. What remained was the echo, faint, distant, eternal. The war had birthed it, necessity had shaped it, but time revealed what it truly was, not a weapon, but a prophecy. In 1941, it had been a dream whispered in a workshop, a scientist staring into the glow of a flame that should not have burned. By 1944, it was a streak of silver light above a dying empire, flying faster than sound could chase it. And by 1945, it was both a miracle and a requiem, proof that even in the darkest years of destruction, human genius could still look toward the stars. Those who built it never forgot what it meant to see the impossible become real. For Hans von Ohain, the sound of the first working jet engine would stay with him forever. He would describe it not as thunder, but as music, a note so pure it seemed to belong to another world. To him, it was never about war. It was about discovery, about freeing flight from the chains of the propeller and giving it the boundless breath of fire. Willy Messerschmitt, driven by ambition, had chased that same dream with a different heart. For him, it was about mastery, the will to command the air, to bend it, to dominate it. But history had its own will. His machine had proven the limits of human vision. Even the greatest invention cannot save a lost cause. And yet, the Me 262 endured. In museums across the world, in Munich, Washington, London, and Dayton, a few still stand, their aluminum skins gleaming softly under dim lights. Children stare at them through glass and wonder how something so graceful could have once been so feared. Engineers walk around them in reverent silence, tracing the lines that define the modern jet age. Every curve, every joint, every rivet carries a kind of poetry, the fusion of desperation and brilliance, tragedy and triumph. The Me 262 was born of chaos, but it gave order to the skies that followed. It marked the moment when flight stopped being bound by mechanics and began to merge with imagination. Its sound, that long, rising howl, became the heartbeat of a new century. From the deserts of Nevada to the frozen runways of Siberia, that same scream of compressed air and fire would soon echo from hundreds of jet engines, launching aircraft faster than ever dreamed, higher than ever dared. In a way, every modern jet is an echo of that first impossible machine. Every takeoff carries within it a fragment of Augsburg. The night when von Ohain refused to give up, the morning when Wendell took to the sky, the hour when the impossible became real. The Me 262 never won its war, but it won something greater. It conquered time. It leapt across generations, bridging the gap between destruction and progress, between nightmare and dream. It turned the science of survival into the art of possibility. Its legacy is not measured in victories, but in velocity, not in kills, but in knowledge, not in conquest, but in creation. And somewhere in that balance between ruin and wonder lies the heart of humanity's greatest paradox, that even in our darkest moments, we build the tools that carry us toward the light. In the end, the Me 262 was not a machine of death, but a messenger. It whispered of what lay beyond war, beyond gravity, beyond fear. When its engines screamed for the first time, the world did not yet have the words for what it heard. But decades later, we can name it. It was the future. The swallow had flown, and the world would never descend again. It began with a single engineer, and an idea the world called crazy. And in that madness, the modern age of flight was born.